Hello, I'm Barry Daniel, and this is the podcast of the Middle Way Society. Our aim is to encourage a universal approach to living a more integrated, ethical life, avoiding dogma or any appeal to authority. My guest today is Philip Kitcher, who is the John Dewey Professor of Philosophy at the University of Columbia. He's the first recipient of the American Philosophical Association's Prometheus Prize for his work to expand the frontiers of science and philosophy. He's written many books, including Philosophy of Science, A New Introduction, Preludes to Pragmatism, and The Ethical Project. His latest book is Life After Faith, The Case for Secular Humanism, and that will be the topic of the conversation today. Hello, Philip. Welcome to the Middle Way Society podcast.
Well, nice to talk to you.
Okay, so could you begin, Philip, by telling us a little bit about your background and what prompted you to write the book?
Absolutely. Well, I grew up in Britain. That's probably not something that your hearers can actually identify. Many people think in Britain think I've completely lost any trace of a British accent, but everybody in the United States knows exactly within a minute of my speaking where I originally came from. So I grew up in Britain. I grew up in with liberal Church of England sort of milieu, and from when I was quite young, I sang in church choirs. Yeah. And gradually, over my teens and 20s, I lapsed from the faith, and I went on singing, and I still sing religious music occasionally. But I think that early training left me with a respect for religion that endures and that makes me dissatisfied with some of the harsher pronouncements that are made these days by people who want to sweep away all religion as superstition, dogma, and utter rubbish. Yeah. So I've been moved to think about these issues throughout my life since turning to philosophy. And I've struggled to articulate my views. And then, I guess it was 5 years ago, I was invited to give the Terry Lectures at Yale University. This is a very fine series of lectures. I'm way out of my league giving the Terry Lectures at Yale, but I did it anyway. And what I wanted to do was use the occasion to develop a positive version of secular humanism that would sum up what I had been thinking about and working towards throughout my life, from those early experiences as a 5-year-old choir boy all the way through the loss of faith, through my own philosophical development, trying to put it all together. Yeah. Really.
Fascinating. Okay, well, could you give us an overview of the book then?
Okay, so I begin by rehearsing what seems to me to be the central argument for skepticism about religion, which is that people tend to acquire the religious beliefs by being in a particular tradition, although, of course, sometimes people do convert to other religions that are sort of around in their social milieu. And so what we have to do is to recognize that contemporary religious belief is, by and large, founded on people's growing up within a certain kind of society and participating in a certain kind of tradition. And these traditions evolve over time. And they are radically incompatible, inconsistent with one another. And so I think every religious believer at some stage should come to terms with the thought that had he or she been brought up in a completely different place at a completely different time, he or she would believe completely different things about the so-called transcendent realm. Yeah. So that's really, it seems to me, the first prong of the skeptical considerations. It's so difficult, I think, to say that one of these traditions is justified and all the rest are complete rubbish. Okay, now when you all then look at the ways in which those traditions grow, the ways that canonical texts and scriptures are put together, then you come to see, I think, that much of this is happenstance. It depends on political contingency. A famous example of this is the way in which the myth of the Jewish participation in a Roman punishment of the person we know as Jesus came about. And when you look at the ways in which people come to adopt religions, you can begin to see religions adapting their messages to particular constituencies, and so on and so forth. All of this makes religion look as though it's an important and central part of human life, but has no particular claims to tell us anything factual about the world. So that's where I start from.
Yeah.
And when I compare that with the more liberal religion with which I grew up, I see a progressive movement in religion, which is the movement towards what I call refined religion, which is away from literalism. So the first part of my argument is simply an argument for thinking that we should think that all the religious doctrines of all the world's major religions are wrong. There's no basis for believing them at all. They're all incompatible with one another. The second prong of the argument is to try to see how the more enlightened and less literalist forms of religion, that I call refined religion, shape up against what I call secular humanism. And so I want in the book to respond to some common worries about secular humanism. Can secular humanism provide a proper account of our ethical values and why we act morally? Can secular humanism come to terms with the meaningfulness of life? Can it offer satisfactory responses to those who fear their own death or who mourn the death of other people? Can it provide satisfactory forms of community that enrich and give rise to people's lives? I think in principle it can, and indeed I think it can in principle do that better than even the most refined versions of religion. But I think that one can't be utopian about this. And in the short term, humanists should band together, whether they're religious humanists or whether they're secular humanists. And that the ultimate and most important goal is to make the world a better place in which human beings can live meaningful and fulfilling lives. And as long as religious people are non-literalistic and ecumenical, then they can join in this movement. I think ultimately it will be succeeded. If I can echo Marx, I think even the most refined religion will eventually wither away. But while we're in process, we should resist, I think, both the dogmatic and ideologically clashing religions, which are so prominent and violent in the world today, and the equally violent responses to them that tear people's religious structures away from them and leave their lives bereft. So I see an alliance for the moment among all humanists, between religious humanism and secular humanism, to move forward towards less literalism, more inclusion, more accommodation, and the development of meaningful and satisfying and just lives for all people. So that's really the theme of the book.
Okay, great. Well, I love the book. I found it a fascinating read, and there's lots of questions I'd like to ask you, but I'd have to, obviously, within the limits of time, I'll keep it to a few. But maybe to just unpack a few things. I mean,
Sure.
It sounds that you are sceptical not only about sort of positive dogmatic beliefs, but negative ones as well. For example, you mentioned a rather stringent type of atheism. You also stress the importance of epistemic humility. If we are to take the sceptical argument seriously and recognise, that we're finite flesh and blood creatures and limited by our senses, cognitive abilities, culture, language, history, etc., how can we ultimately know anything?
How can we ultimately know anything? Well, our senses are limited, and our cognitive faculties are not by no means perfect, but they can tell us quite a lot about the world around us. Yeah. And science, not just the natural sciences, but the social sciences and parts of the humanities, which are forms of disciplined inquiry, have enriched our understanding of the world and our place enormously. So, as I look down at the floor, I see a dog sleeping, and I think my sensory faculties are perfectly good at telling me that there's a sleeping dog in my vicinity. And the science is built on that. They tell us things about the structure of space and time. They tell us things about the history of life. They tell us things about the future probabilities of climate change. And they tell us these things on a reliable basis. Now, what I think we know from studying religious doctrines and the ways in which those have developed over time and the ways in which those have been changed is that we don't have anything similar for fathoming the existence of some transcendent realm. So I don't think that we have any good basis whatsoever for thinking that there's a special realm that's completely different from the mundane world in which we live and the world as it's disclosed by the various forms of scientific and humanistic inquiry. That being said, I can't completely rule out the possibility that one day people will find some aspect of reality and they'll say, that's what all those religious people were getting at all along. That's what they were on about. Could happen. It could happen that the world we will disclose by future science will turn out to have 67 dimensions. But I see no reason in our daily life right now to think that the world has 67 dimensions, and no reason to think in terms of any kind of transcendent, which is why I reject even the most refined forms of religion, the forms that say, well, yeah, all religions have these doctrines, they're to be taken allegorically or metaphorically or non-literally, and they're all gestures towards a part of the world in which we don't fully understand. I mean, I think that's a much better thing than to say that these doctrines are literally true. Don't get me wrong about that. Yeah. But still, I think it's a step too far. I know about the dog. I know about the history of life. I know about climate change. I know about quarks and things like that. But I really don't have any basis for sticking my neck out about a transcendent part of reality. So that's part of my reason for resisting even the most refined forms of religion. I want an alliance with them to make the world a better place for people. But I think in the end, as I said, that their appeal will gradually wither away.
Okay. Well, I'll just maybe explain our position a little bit. I personally anyway, would describe myself as a hard agnostic in the sense...
Not a soft atheist.
Sorry?
Not a soft atheist. I describe myself as a soft atheist.
Well, I think maybe they're just very similar, really. I suppose that a hard agnostic is the recognition that we can never achieve certainty in our knowledge because of our finite and embodied nature. But I think it's also, I think this is alluding to what you're saying, it's important not to confuse agnosticism with indecisiveness. For example, we in the society, we try to avoid using the term certainty to mean both absolute certainty and incremental confidence. So just to avoid confusion, we prefer the term confidence for certainty that we feel on the basis of experience rather than asserting metaphysically. So that would make it clear when someone said they were 100% confident, they didn't mean absolutely certain. For example, I'm 100% confident that the Second World War happened, or that Cupid wasn't the reason why me and my partner got together. But I don't know. But to give you a practical example of hard agnosticism in play, and this is from Robert Ellis, who's the chair of the society. If a bank, for example, borrowed your money and promised to pay it back with substantial interest at some point in the future, but neither gave you any control as to when it did so, nor specified when it would do so, you would be justified in not trusting this bank's approach to business, right? So, I mean, similarly, the abstract belief that God will requite us at some point in the future just has no equivalence in experience and thus no genuine value.
Well, I think that's a pretty good example. I was thinking as you were saying that yes, we are very close. I also don't believe that we know anything with absolute certainty. I mean, actually, as a philosopher, I am distinctive for having rejected any kind of absolutely certain knowledge, even for logic and mathematics. Some of my colleagues think I'm a bit wacky about this, but I don't even think that even in those domains we achieve certainty. So I'm right with you there. But I do think that we have the sort of complete confidence, you called it 100% confidence, that is enough for decisive action in everyday life. I liked your word. That doesn't mean we're indecisive. That seems to me very good. And it seems to me that we should operate as if there are dogs around sleeping near us, and as if banks who make that sort of offer are untrustworthy, and we should operate as if there isn't anything transcendent, while holding out the possibility that some future form of inquiry may do what I described, sort of find some aspect of reality, and people say, now I've got it. Yeah, now I understand what those religions were on about. Yeah. But, that until that day dawns, we're entirely right, it seems to me, in confidently going on with our lives on a fully secular basis.
Just at one point there, though, for example, on that point about religions, maybe in the future there might be some evidence that telepathy exists or ghosts or whatever, although I'm very skeptical about those things. But like the concept of God as an infinite being, I think I always have to remain in an ultimate sense agnostic about that, because I'm a finite being. Even if the clouds open now and some God said, I smite you, whatever, that could be just some teenage alien from another universe.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that you can't experience the infinite in some sense or another. I suspect mathematicians would say that, yeah, sure, we can experience the infinite, but you're absolutely right about the smiting and the opening up of the sky and all the rest of it. What it means to be an infinite being in that sense is, of course, something on which theologians have lavished a great deal of attention, and it's very, 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 very difficult indeed. I think that's why the kind of theology I like most is the kind of liberal theology.
Yeah.
One of the people who gave this lecture series at Yale, the Terry Lectures before me, is Paul Tillich, who wrote this famous book, The Courage to Be. And, he basically says at the end, he talks about the God beyond God, admitting that there's no word that he can use to describe this being. That seems to me right.
Yeah.
If there is such a thing as a transcendent realm, it's completely beyond our description. Okay. And at best, what we've got are poems and metaphors and allegories for thinking about it.
No, I can agree with that. Okay, let's move on a little bit more about religion. The philosopher Ninian Smart talked about the 6 dimensions of religion: the mythic, the social, the experiential, the moral, the doctrinal, and the ritual. Now, we've arguably all been influenced to a lesser or greater degree by these dimensions. And from this perspective, saying you're not religious, couldn't it be a bit like saying you're not geographical or you're not historical? Just as we have a location and we all have a history, we all have significant stories, social groupings, experiences, moral practices, beliefs and rituals, etc., that often cohere as sources and expressions of our values. Now, in the Middle Way Society, it's the doctrinal dimension that we're skeptical about.
I think exactly. This seems to me a very profitable way to think about things, and it's very much in line with what I'm trying to do in the book.
Yeah.
As I read people like Richard Dawkins, the New Atheists, they say, well, religion is all about beliefs, what doctrines people hold.
Yeah.
And it's bad for people to hold false beliefs, so let's take those away from them, and then problem solved, everything over. But that's simply to neglect all of the other dimensions of religion. And it seems to me that secular societies like yours, like humanist associations across the world, like the Ethical Culture Society, which is in New York, the Unitarian movement in the United States, all of these things are trying to respond to those other dimensions. They're trying to recognize that, yes, we do have histories, and we do occupy places, and we do need community, and we do need to come together on various kinds of moral ventures, and we do need to talk to one another about deep and important things in human life. And you can't, as it were, just pursue a scorched earth policy a la Dawkins and walk away and not expect that noxious weeds will grow up where you've, as it were, raised the soil. It seems to me that humanism, in any of its forms, has to be a positive movement, and that was the impetus that really drove me to write the book. I did it autobiographically when I talked to you at the beginning, but now I'm doing it thematically. Yeah. It's what I experienced when I was young, what you experienced when you obviously, and because you've just talked about it in terms of these other dimensions, that seems so important. And the doctrine one can let go, but one must hang on to many of these other important parts of religion, very broadly construed.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, well, it's interesting you say about me. I personally don't have a God-shaped hole in my life. Religion, in a more sort of explicit sense, never really figured. My parents were both atheists.
Interesting.
But, however, I don't have a problem with people experiencing God or the idea of the Buddha or whatever in an experiential sense, as long as they experience it as just that it's a meaningful experience, rather than positing that's a divine truth out there. I think that can actually be very, very helpful, as an archetype.
I agree. Look, John Dewey, in his Terry lectures at Yale, A Common Faith, said this best. He said, look, religious experiences are important to us because they can be transformative. They can help us become better people. They can help us understand ourselves more. They can help make our lives more meaningful and better for those around us. Let's focus on that and not worry about where they come from.
Yeah, sure.
And that seems to be absolutely right. What you should focus on in so-called religious experiences are the really good and transformative things, which can come not just from, if you think that the voice of your deity is talking to you, they can come on occasions when you're looking at a sleeping child, or you are in a beautiful landscape, or you're talking to a friend and something about the friend's face suddenly makes you understand the importance of that individual human being. These experiences are not restricted to sort of so-called religious causes. But what we should value about all these experiences, it seems to me, across the board, is their power to do positive things in our lives. Yeah. And, you mentioned one of my books, Preludes to Pragmatism. This seems to me at the heart of the pragmatist vision, that you ask about people's experiences, not simply where do they come from or what do they disclose, but what are they good for? What kinds of things do they do for people? And that seems to me a very good question to ask about religious experience, or so-called religious experience.
Sure, I agree there. You mentioned earlier a phrase that I really like. People who are religious, that they need to come to terms with the ambiguity or the doubt with transcendent ideas. And the Chinese sometimes say a religious sensibility is one of coming to terms with or reconciling oneself with the great matter of birth and death. Now, what are your thoughts on the idea that it's only when religions try to posit answers or truth to this conundrum that they get into trouble?
I think the importance of societies like the humanist movement, and I don't know enough about yours, but I rather suspect about your society, is that they provide forums for coming to terms with these kinds of questions. that's really important. I think, I live in a terribly atomistic country where, the regnant vision of capitalism is ruthless competition, and many people only find community here in their religious organizations. And that's a terrible thing. But it seems to me that we, as beings, we have to have places in which we can go and we can talk with other people and meditate and reflect and exchange ideas about the questions of birth and death and growth and vision and so forth. This is terribly important. If that's what religion gives you, it's too important simply to do what the most vigorous new atheists want to do, snatch it away. That's why I began my book with an epigraph from Tolstoy, from Anna Karenina, where Tolstoy's protagonist, or one of his protagonists, Levin, who was actually, he's a vision of Tolstoy, as Tolstoy might have been, has rejected religion in the name of science, and he finds himself in the position of someone who's traded away his warm and comfortable fur coat for sort of scanty cloth, muslin, and he's exposed to the elements, presumably in a Russian winter, and feels the intense cold. Well, it seems to me that our need for community and our need to face up to these very deep issues about life and death is like that. And you get rid of the doctrines, okay, but you can't get rid of the concentration on the questions and the need for us to discuss them with others and to participate with others.
Sure. Okay. Shall we move on to ethics now? You suggest that in the book that one of the difficulties of an ethics separated from religion lies in the difficulty of producing any persuasive rival account of ethics and of values generally. That will not reduce ethical life to the expression of subjective values. So how do we get around this?
Well, okay, so this is a very short version in the book, and it will be an even shorter version now of a very long story. Okay. I think the ethical life grows out of the human condition. And the human condition is that we are animals who are social, we need one another, and we're not particularly well adapted for the kind of social life that we lead. And the great human breakthrough is our ability to increase our responsiveness to other people, our ability to fathom what they're doing and to take positive steps to help them in achieving it. Call that responsiveness. To increase that responsiveness through mutual discussion and through specifying patterns and rules of behavior for our lives together. That's where ethical life comes from, and it starts very simply, it seems to me, probably about 50,000 or 100,000 years ago, and by the time we get to the first written documents, 5,000 years ago, it's gotten very complicated indeed. And it goes on getting more and more complicated. Ethics is, for me, as it was for Dewey, an unfinished business. We continue to work at it. We continue to try to make ourselves more responsive to those around us. In a certain sense, this is a secular version of the central message of the New Testament, the message of Hillel, the message of the Buddha, the message of many great religious traditions. It's identifying ourselves with others, taking on their point of view, and making that part of our own conduct. And the ways in which we do that are through conversation and continuing to explore one another's humanity. In the end, I think all religious versions of ethics make an unnecessary and distracting move in that they see this as going through some deity or through some version of the transcendent. For me, it's all horizontal. It's our coming to terms with other human beings and learning how to live responsibly and responsively with them. So that's the way I see ethical values as generated. We're at a particular stage in this. Our ancestors were at a more primitive stage in it. We've made some progress, although we don't always make progress in ethical life. We can expect, with luck, that our descendants will make more progress on it than we've made.
Okay, no,
I hope so.
I can really relate to that. Also, what you said there, that our ethical life or the ethical project that we are engaged in is a work in progress.
Yes.
And there are no final goals.
That's right. That's right. We make progress in it by solving the problems. There's no end, just as there's no complete ideal of perfect human health. But medicine makes progress by overcoming the problems that beset people.
Okay. Yeah.
It's just like that.
Yeah.
Ethics is, if you like, a kind of social medicine. It's a way of overcoming the built-in lack of a sort of psychological, biological adaptation to respond to those around us.
Okay. But
it's a cure for that particular kind of disease, if you like.
In relation to that, and this you might draw on your experience as a philosopher of science. What for you makes one judgment more reasonable than another?
In the ethical terrain, in the scientific terrain, it's working out constantly methods that prove reliable for exploring bits and pieces of nature. And one judges reliability by looking at the ways in which our conclusions enable you to predict and to intervene in nature. So I think that the geneticists who sequence genomes are onto something, because they can do such extraordinary things at manipulating organisms. They can produce all kinds of changes in organisms. It's an amazingly rich and varied, varied set of successes. Okay, now in the ethical domain, I think the corresponding idea of objectivity and good method comes from using our best factual information in conversations with one another that try to explore all the points of view after they have been corrected by what factual information we have, and that seek a solution to problems that beset us that all participants can live with.
Yeah.
That's the way ethical life goes. So ethical objectivity, I'm going to say this as a philosopher, ethical objectivity isn't the relation to some independently existing ethical world that we're trying to find. Ethical objectivity comes from a kind of intersubjectivity, that is, reaching agreement, reasonable agreement with others in a way that explores as far as we can our responsiveness to those other people and their particular points of view.
Okay.
That's how ethical investigation should work.
Okay, and then just sticking with the idea of objectivity, what are your thoughts on Thomas Nagel's idea that the concept of objectivity being not as a view from nowhere, but in its more sort of common, everyday, incremental form, as in, come on, Philip, be more objective. In this way, you can arguably dispense with...
I actually think you've got Tom wrong there. I think Tom wants the view from nowhere. Okay. I mean, he's famous for this. I want the view from everywhere at once. So I regard myself actually as, in something of a debate with people like Tom Nagel and Derek Parfit and Tim Scanlon, all of whom are great contemporary ethical philosophers. I mean, all three really superbly brilliant people. But I'm in a debate with them because what they want is objectivity somehow to be there in the world. There's something that grounds ethical judgment. And I want to say no, it's actually a human construct. Ethics is a human construction, but it's not an individual or an idiosyncratic construction. It comes about in response to a specific human problem, and it's achieved through taking everybody's perspective and seeking to reconcile those perspectives. So I don't want the view from nowhere. I want the view from everywhere. Interestingly, the person in the history of ethics who comes closest to this is someone who's primarily known as an economist, Adam Smith, whose first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, is all about the way in which we construct what Smith calls the impartial spectator by taking on other people's points of view and trying to produce a synthetic picture of good conduct by synthesizing all points of view. Yeah. So I feel I'm reviving that kind of approach.
Okay, but then maybe I've got this wrong here, Philip, but if we recognize our embodied flesh and blood nature, can we be truly impartial? You know, like there was someone recently, a judge in the UK, that was involved in a potential scandal, a governmental scandal, and she had some connection with another politician, and so, you know, it was ruled that she shouldn't be the judge in this case, and she was outraged because she said, I'm a judge, you know, despite my friendship with this person, I can remain completely impartial. He said, I'm not sure she can.
Well, I think this is one of those cases where it's probably better for her to step down because many other people would have your doubts about her, and it's important not just that she be impartial, but that she be understood to be impartial. Yeah. But let me address your first question. Can we achieve impartiality? Probably not. But we can overcome our biases. So again, I'm going to go pragmatist on you and talk about Dewey a little bit. You know, Dewey says, let's try to make things better, not worry about making things perfect. Yeah. And I'm going to echo that. Yeah. We can be more inclusive of other people's points of view. We can be more responsive to them. We can take into account more intersubjective points of view rather than seeking perfection here. Sure. Let's just continue to try to march forward and make it a bit better.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. We have a saying in the society, the perfect is the enemy of the good.
Yeah, well, I can endorse that. Yeah. Okay. I can endorse that. There shouldn't be a slogan for laziness, but it's a good thing to have in mind that very often in attempting to achieve what's perfect, you fail to make any advances whatsoever. Yeah. Whereas if you settle for something imperfect, you would actually achieve something really good.
Okay, now let's move on to another question. So what gives life meaning from a secular humanism perspective?
I'll give you a short answer. Making a difference to other lives. Now, if you want me to expand on that, I'll contrast it with what I think there's a form of religious sort of perspective that I think is very seductive, and that is that a life can only be meaningful if it makes a contribution, you know, under the aegis of eternity, that it's permanent, that it's enduring, that it never goes away. And then the religious person says, you see, if with my infinite God, right, and I do God's will, then my life becomes thoroughly meaningful. Yeah. And I say, you don't need the infinite. What you need is something bigger than yourself. And so I like this image of a stone thrown into a pond. You know, if you throw a stone into a pond, and you'll see ripples, and the ripples will get less and less and less, and they'll finally fade out. And that seems to me the impact of our lives. For some of us, the ripples go on longer than others. But what's really important is that there should be that positive after effect, the rippling that survives for a time. Okay. And I think if our lives are connected with those of others, if we've made a positive difference to other lives, then we can count our lives as successful and meaningful. They may be full of hardship, they may be full of pain, but if there's a real positive impact that we have on other people, that hardship, that pain can be outweighed.
So it's not just ripples, it's positive ripples.
Yeah. The ripples are taken to be assumed to be positive. Yeah.
Okay. This is, I suppose, this is our take on meaning. It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on it. I mean, if we are to avoid metaphysics, there can be no meaning to life as a whole beyond the meaning that we experience. I mean, that John Dewey would say a similar thing, arguably. That may sound like a familiar truism, that the meaning of life is just what we make of it. However, the middle way implies a couple of other points here as well. Not only is there no absolute metaphysical meaning to life, but there is no denial of meaning either. Life is not meaningless, but rather full of the meaning we find in it. The other crucial point here is that meaning is an incremental matter. We're not going to find meaning all at once as a solution to all our struggles to find meaning. Rather, we can gradually increase the meaningfulness we encounter in life.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree completely with that. It seems to me too subjective. I don't think that that people who conceive their lives as being meaningful are always right about it. I think that the meaningful life should be one that a person at his or her death, I'll go back to Tolstoy again, this time to the death of Ivan Ilyich, right? So Ivan Ilyich, lying on his deathbed, is worrying about what his life has added up to. Now, people can console themselves on their deathbeds with falsehoods, and they could die thinking that they had lived meaningful lives, and conversely, they can be distraught on their deathbeds that they haven't done enough, even though their lives are meaningful.
Yeah.
That I would allow for both of those possibilities. Yeah. And it seems to me that somebody who has tended, I'm going to purposely not go for, the huge achievements or anything like that, but somebody who has tended a family and a community and nurtured it and seen it through hard times and kept it going and sustained it, so that children and younger members of that community can go on enjoying a certain kind of life after that person's death. But that person has done things meaningfully, even if he or she on his or her deathbed is dissatisfied and in despair.
Yeah. That's
not right. And people around him or her should be saying, no, look at all that you've done. You shouldn't fall into despair and sadness at this moment. You should concentrate. You should see how much you've achieved for us here in this place at this time.
Yeah.
And that seems to me right. So I don't think it's just what you experience. There is this objective feature that some people touch lives that come after them. In the book, I give the example of Keats, on the one hand, who dies very young, but still speaks to people who come after him. But I also give the example of, like the one I've just given you, of a farmer who tends the family farm, improves it, passes it on to children, sustains part of the community in a small village, etc., etc., etc. There are lots and lots of ways, it seems to me, of living meaningful lives. I don't think that some of our capitalist contemporary societies encourage those things. And I'm particularly critical of the ways in which, at the moment in the United States, I think it's very difficult for many ordinary people to live meaningful lives because of the ways in which the community is destroyed and individuals are separated from one another. I do believe that some religious organizations, including some that are quite literalistic, provide spaces in which people can achieve the kinds of interactions with one another, the kinds of community that do give their lives meaning. And that seems to me one of the principal things that's wrong with the new atheism. This goes back to your question about Ninian Smart's dimensions, by the way.
Yeah.
The meaningful life really depends on some of those dimensions. And when religions are the only things that provide those dimensions, then if you just abolish all religion, as Dawkins and his friends would like to do, you really do leave people bereft. You leave them with that very thin sort of cotton coat to face the Russian winter, to go back to the other Tolstoy analogy. Yeah. So that's the sort of way I think about meaning, and I think it's not fundamentally at odds with what I think you think, but I don't like this. Life is the meaning of life is what you experience it as being, because I think that doesn't get at something important about human connections that can outrun people's experience.
Yeah. No, I would agree with you there, actually. Maybe I should have explained a bit more fully what I meant by that. I don't think meaningfulness is just connected with experience. Maybe it's more like incremental meaningfulness there is a correlation with our degree of integration. Now, you talked about in the book...
Yes, that's good. I like that. Yeah. I like that. Yes, I like that a lot.
Yeah, because you talk about the book that, you've got a lot of integrative practices in religious communities, but there's no, as you say, there's no reason. I mean, it's great that they're there, but there's no reasons why people can't get involved in such types of integrative practices from a secular or agnostic perspective. For example, in our own society, like, for example, we encourage things like meditation and embodied practices like yoga and Tai Chi, but also things like involvement in the arts, because not only the arts helps you expand your fund of symbols in the world, but also cultivates a tolerance of ambiguity, arguably. And then in the realm of belief, things like critical thinking, philosophy, getting involved in politics, and think what we're doing now. I mean, this is all good stuff. This is all integrative.
Yeah. I agree completely with that. I mean, I think this does not require a religious setting. I mean, look, this is why Dawkins overlooks it, because he's really deeply into a very healthy community. He's part of a community of inquirers. He engages in important projects with them. It's so easy for him to think that the whole world provides opportunities for everybody like that, but it doesn't. Yeah. That's sad, and we need more of the sorts of things that societies like yours and like the Ethical Culture Society, Unitarian movement, the humanist movement provide. And one thing I say in the book is, and I don't know whether this is true of your movement or not, because I don't know enough about it, but it seems to me that actually the churches which have been experimenting with this, the churches, the synagogues, the mosques, the temples, have this pretty well worked out by now at their best. They've done lots of experiments and they know how to make it really work. It's not clear to me that secular societies either can do at the moment or can be expected to do at the moment anything similarly successful on so broad a scale. I think, there are going to be growing pains. And so, as I say, the secular world isn't going to be built in a day.
Yeah. No, I agree.
There's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah. Okay, moving on to my last question, Philip. What is your understanding of the middle way, if any, and how might it relate to what we've been talking about today?
Well, I looked a little bit at some of the links that you originally sent me. And I think there's something that I should probably explore more than I have. And one very discerning reviewer of my book points this out, that there's a sense in which it's a little bit too Western. In fact, more than a little bit too Western. And one thing that struck me about the middle way was how much you've actually absorbed from Buddhism and other Eastern traditions, but particularly Buddhism. And I like that. I think I need to know more about it. And I think that's distinctive and interesting and important. The middle way strikes me as a fledgling movement. I'm not being insulting here. I hope I'm not being insulting here. For just the reasons I've given. I mean, I don't know how long you've been in existence.
Not long.
But you haven't been in existence for 2,000 years.
No. 18 months.
Sorry?
18 months.
18 months, wow. Well, when I look at the Society for Ethical Culture, which has been in existence a lot longer, I still see it's in its sort of late childhood or early adolescence or something like that. It's got a lot of things still to work out.
Sure.
Before it has the same kind of power. And now I'll go right back to where I started, to the 5-year-old choir boy, the teenager. I mean, I grew up in a not terribly well-to-do environment. I grew up in Sussex, in a town where most people who had children were part of the serving class rather than the privileged class, and I have to say that the church in which I grew up, it was a pretty unaesthetic building, was the center of a really vital community. It was non-dogmatic in lots of ways, and it did a lot for people who were struggling, and a lot of people were struggling. And I think it drew on centuries of tradition that enabled it to provide comfort and consolation and support and community and all sorts of things. I think that's very hard to achieve. And that's why I say the fully secular world won't be built in a day. But I think it's great that there are humanist societies that are trying, and I think they should experiment, and that we shouldn't be compelled to judge those experiments too quickly. It's a familiar fact about scientific practice that experiments usually take a lot of time and a lot of adjustment to get them to work. And that should apply, I think, to humanism as well.
Okay. Well, it's been great talking to you today, Philip. Thank you very much for giving up your time to
Thank you. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much.
You can find out more about middle way philosophy at www.middlewaysociety.org.